very much. I think it's worth noting that Sumrine, coming from divergent backgrounds, quite a rare gem, and I think that those different backgrounds combine fairly excellently, you'll have to say. It's probably a thing to be proud of, I think, if you have so many different things to you that you can't put on a government form. I think that's probably something that you should be quite happy about, although I'm sure from time to time it's probably inconvenient and annoying. But I can never fill out the entire form myself. I think I've got enough on offer, so kudos to you. Next, younger generation, second generation speaker is Jeevan Nadanakumar. He is also a law student at the ANU, studies economics as well. He works for World Vision, and unfortunately, don't judge him too harsh by this. He used to be a broadcaster, a youth broadcaster with FM 91.1 community radio, and coming from someone that works in that industry, and there's another person that works in that industry, you're not all quality people. Some of you are a little bit shady, but I've got it on good authority that Jeevan is actually a fantastic young man, and he is about to share his views with you, so please welcome him.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Elliot. I'll leave the judgment to you and the audience. I'd like to start today by saying good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for being here today, and also to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathered, the Ngunnawal people. And I'd also like to acknowledge Forum Australia, who have been doing this as I did now for almost 10 years, fostering meaningful discussion and debate on a whole variety of topics and contemporary issues that affect Australians. So thank you very much, not just for organising today's discussion, but for doing this over the last 10 years. I think you really made people think, and I think that's a great thing. Today's discussion on living across cultures is particularly relevant in today's world, where you can listen to the radio, where you can open your newspaper, you can watch the news, you can scroll through your social media newsfeed, and every day you'll see a whole host of buzzwords thrown around by our politicians, our journalists and commentators, like radicalisation, Western values, Team Australia. And quite often, those words are used without people thinking about how they affect or are perceived by young Australians who are born in this country and who experience the dual pressures and expectations of the Western society in which they're growing up, as well as the cultural background of their parents. I speak today from the perspective of a young Tamil Australian, a first-generation Tamil Australian in that I was born here, but my parents migrated. My father came here from Sri Lanka in the late 80s, and my mother in the early 90s. So unlike Sumrine, I don't have two different backgrounds. Both my parents are Tamil. But I do feel that in some ways I understand what it's like to live across cultures, because I face the pressures of growing up in a white-dominated Western society, as well as the cultural background of my parents, grandparents, and the Tamil community here in Australia. So I like to think that over the last 21 years, I've had what I call the best of both worlds. I can experience both cultures equally. I'm equally comfortable wearing a suit, like I am today, and I'm comfortable wearing a kurta. And it was quite a hard decision to make, Thai Agra, Indian food. I could have done either, but I chose a suit. I can appreciate the musical talents of Justin Timberlake just as I can Zakir Hussain. I can enjoy meat, free veg, mashed potatoes and a barbecue for dinner, just as much as I can enjoy the spicy and delicious Indian meal that we can share tonight. And despite living in a Western society, I can immerse myself fully and truly in both my cultural traditions, practices, religious rituals, social gatherings, pop culture and language of my parents, and of Australia. But not all of my peers can say that. Some of them struggle. They struggle with their identity. They struggle with the conflicting expectations that are often placed on them. They struggle with the idea that they have to seamlessly interchange between both cultures on a day-to-day basis. Imagine waking up at home with your family and then going to school or work, coming back and maybe you visit a temple or a church or a mosque, and then go back to work the next day, then on the weekend you're at a community event. Already within the space of a few days, you've had to go in and out of your many different hats. The many different hats that you have to wear. And one of the examples of those conflicting expectations which I'd like to bring up is the idea of education and what our parents expect of us. For people of my background, it's almost a given that you will go to university. You must have a tertiary education, preferably medicine or accounting or law. So I think I've met the criteria. And why? Why is that expectation placed on me by my parents and our family? Is it a bad thing? Well, if you think deeply about it, there's actually a good reason. My parents came from a country where they suffered discrimination because of their ethnicity, where they had to get higher marks to get into a university course compared to people of other backgrounds. And so the only way they could do well was to study hard and get a degree. And getting a degree itself was so much harder just because they had to get more marks than the person sitting next to them. And so that's what they expect of us. That's what they think will give us the brightest future. And in many ways they're correct. But we have to understand why they feel that way, and that's the reason. It's because of that lived experience of war and discrimination that I don't experience here in Australia. So when my cousins or friends think of ideas such as pursuing a trade or starting their own business without going to university, our parents and community leaders are often baffled. They're like, what? But you should go to university. And so often it requires understanding from people of my generation, as well as understanding of people from an older generation. One of the issues that I think that these conflicting expectations have caused is the development of the coconut. Now you might be sitting there confused, asking yourself, what is the coconut? According to the Urban Dictionary, the coconut is none other than someone who has brown skin on the outside, but behaves and identifies as a white person on the inside. It's characterized by a rejection of their cultural values, background, language, practices, or at the very least, it's a lack of involvement or association with people of their cultural community. Now, there could be a myriad of factors that explain why a young person today could turn into a coconut. It could be the friendships and networks that they associate with. It could be the overly strong and strong pressures by their parents and grandparents and family. It could just be their personal preferences. But more seriously, it could be the consequence of an internalization that in our society, the white racial preference is the best preference. And this idea that it could be embarrassing to associate themselves with a non-Western culture. And if that's the case, I think as a society we have some real issues to address. Now I think many parents and senior members of our cultural communities tend to think that because they're living away from their home country, the only way to ensure that their culture continues into the future is to enforce it more strictly with their children. I actually think the opposite is true. I actually think that our elders and our parents should recognize that cultures need to adapt and change and be malleable over time. And rather than enforcing it upon their children, they should simply stand back, lead by example, and show them how they can actually embrace both cultures. And when they're given that freedom, I think they'll realize, I'm talking about young people, I think the young people will realize that their difference is a good thing. It's a positive difference. It's something that makes them unique and stands out. It's something that they want to be proud of. And over time, it's something they actually want to show off to all the other people they know. In order to get to that stage, we need to give them the freedom to learn and embrace that on their own. I think my parents, personally, did a fantastic job of ensuring that I can learn to live like every other young Australian, that I can engage with them, that I can relate to them, that I can be one of them. But through their example, they also showed me that I never had to choose whether I wanted to be Tamil or Australian. I never had to make that choice because they told me I could be both. And when given that freedom, I chose to do that. So I tried to think quite hard about what I am. I couldn't think of a fruit or a vegetable that quite accurately described what I was. So I thought of an ice cream. I thought of a coffee-flavored Magnum and brown on the outside. But on the inside, I'm sweet. But also, I'm that nice golden colour that blends and fuses together coffee and milk. And when I want to, depending on the situation, I can increase the blend of coffee, or I can increase the blend of milk. and that helps me interact with and relate to every situation and all the people I meet in Australia. And I think that's what allows me to experience the best of both worlds. Thank you. Thank you.
Jeevan, Nadanakumar. Thank you very much, Jeevan. Wonderfully spoken. I could see a few of the older, more mature people in the room, their eyes light up a little bit when Jeevan started to talk about understanding parents' expectations and trying to get to the root of the anguish about career choice and that kind of thing. It's hopefully a little bit relieving to hear the younger generation does actually take that sort of thing into account, but as Jeevan noted, it sort of is expected to flow both ways, and there's also a need for the older generation to understand the younger ones.